Hello, everyone, and welcome to this University of Wollongong webinar covering the latest in wildfire management and research. I'm Andrew McCullough, and I'll be the host for today. Tonight, we have alumni and students of UAW joining us from around the world, Canada, the US, Australia, many other locations, I believe, are online to join us. So thanks very much for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which we're all joining from today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney, and also acknowledge and pay my respects to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. There's a lot we can learn from Indigenous culture in relation to wildfires and natural hazards. And New South Wales has recently experienced significant flooding. I've been out working in the floods, and I was in Gundagai last year and learned about the role of Aboriginal people in 1952 floods, where they saved the lives of many colonial settlers from their roofs using wooden canoes. It played a really important role. The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and the space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things. The university acknowledges the real and devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. So I'd now like to introduce Professor Patricia M. Davidson, President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Wollongong, to say a few words to welcome us here today.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's wonderful to be here. Firstly, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the land on which I am today. I'm at our Sydney campus, on Gadigal campus, and as Andrew's mentioned, I also acknowledge the enduring cultures and wisdom of Indigenous people all around the world, and we have much to learn from them. Today, this is a very exciting event as a Vice-Chancellor to have all our amazing alumni throughout the world. I had the great pleasure this year of having visited, in particular Canada, having 2 alumni events. And I hope some of you are here on the call, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Being from the University of Wollongong unites us in many ways, but I think today we gather here in unity and urgency because wildfires, or bushfires as we call them here in Australia, are not confined by borders or boundaries. They are a global crisis and a universal emergency. From Australia, we looked on in horror at the devastating fire season in Canada and Hawaii. And as an Australian of some years, I have endured many bushfire events. And, we face our bushfire season with fear and trepidation. I also look back on my nursing career and have very graphic memories of dealing with some tragic burns occurring from devastating fires. We know this danger is increasing, and the fires themselves are much more catastrophic than ever before. They're like apocalypse images. So this is a moment to transcend geographical divisions and share our knowledges, resources, and cultural tools to address this crisis. And as a global University of Wollongong alumni community, we are well prepared to share our knowledge and experiences. At the University of Wollongong, we are unwavering in our global outreach and our commitment to working with international partners. Today, we are really honoured to have an expert panel of distinguished speakers to discuss the latest and most pressing developments in firefighting technologies and wildfire management techniques. They will also give us some really practical advice on life-saving ways, on tips to protect our homes and families from the ferocity of these fires. And our panel today is made up of the University of Wollongong alumni, academic, and industry partners who will be introduced to you by our fabulous MC. This webinar we see as not just an event, but a lifeline. We will be taking some of the really critical aspects of the imperative of funding research in wildfires or bushfires. We're going to kick off in Giving Tuesday a fundraising appeal to support research for this really critical area. Thank you so much, every one of you, for being here today to be part of this crucial conversation and a global fight to protect our communities, our environments, and all of our heritage. And as the world faces so much grief, loss, and devastation, it's wonderful to come together as a global University of Wollongong community to focus on the future and making the world a better place. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Professor Davidson, for that welcome and timely reminder of some of the challenges that we face, particularly through bushfires and wildfires in the world we're in at the moment. So let's get into it. So a bit about me and the panel. I'm a 2012 graduate of the Engineering Department and Commerce faculty of University of Wollongong. Currently work in the New South Wales Premier's Department in Sydney. I'm leading a review of emergency volunteering following the recent floods in New South Wales, and also co-host Australia's leading disaster podcast, Me, Myself and Disaster, which you can find online. To the rest of the panel, and we've got a whole heap of experts here today joining us. And I'll start with Jesse Thrush, who is the Director of Business Development at Overwatch Imaging. He has a 30-year background in law enforcement, firefighting and rotor wing aviation. Throughout his career, he has spearheaded groundbreaking advancements, introducing innovative aircraft, cutting-edge technologies and unmatched levels of aviation operations, particularly in the utility market and aerial firefighting sectors. From the University of Wollongong, we have Owen Price, who is the Director of the UAW Centre for Environmental Risk Management of Bushfires. He graduated from the University of York in 1985 with a Bachelor of Science in Biology, then did a Master's in Information Technology before working at the University of Cambridge. He then married an Australian and moved to Darwin for 13 years, working in wildlife research, and then moved to Wollongong, where he specialised in all matters relating to empirical evidence of bushfire impact and the effectiveness of risk mitigation measures. In 2020, he took on the directorship of the Centre for Environmental Risk Management of Bushfires at UAW, and in 2021, his team was awarded the National Eureka Prize for Applied Environmental Science. We also have with us today Dr. Heather Simpson, and Heather is the Fire Science Manager at the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre. Heather was born and raised in Canada before she embarked on a decade-long adventure in Australia, earning her PhD from the University of Wollongong. Today, she's back in Canada with her husband and young son. In her current role, she bridges the gap between scientific research and practical fire and emergency management. With over 10 years of firefighting experience and extensive leadership roles, Dr. Simpson brings a unique blend of academic expertise and hands-on knowledge to solve complex challenges. So welcome to our panel, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to ask a few questions, but today this is an opportunity for you as well to ask questions. Please feel free to put them into the chat and really want to understand from you what wildfires means in your area. So I'll ask a few questions to the panel to start off with, and then we'll take some audience questions towards the end. So I'll start with Owen. A question to you, Owen, and it's really understanding the intensity and frequency of wildfires, because they seem to have increased in recent years. We're seeing the Black Summer bushfires in Australia and those recent fires in Canada and Maui. What can we expect in the future as this bushfire risk changes?
Thanks, Andrew. Look, it's a pretty complicated story, but I think I might start by giving a bit of context. I put myself as one of the vast majority of fire scientists who have long been thoroughly convinced about the science of climate change. But that's one thing, but to actually attribute fire events to climate change has always been very difficult, because what we're talking about is things that happen at the extreme. So rare events, and it's very hard to attribute any of those rare events to any particular cause. But what has happened recently, the 2019-20 bushfires in Australia changed the whole game, and it's really enabled us fire scientists to be thoroughly convinced that climate change is already on us. And so essentially what we can see for the future is more of that sort of thing. Not that you're going to have extreme fires every year, but the likelihood of events like that are going to increase. So what are we talking about? Obviously, it's about bigger fires more often, and probably the intensity or severity of them increasing. So what that means for us in terms of plants and animals, we're particularly worried, I guess, in 3 areas. The first is that as fires get larger and more severe, there's going to be more mortality for animals and plants. But the second area is that what's going to happen is the interval between fires is going to reduce. And there's a whole bunch of species that are very sensitive to this interval. So one of the main ones that we tend to talk about is obligate cedar plants. So these are plants that essentially they're killed by fire and they set seed, and then those seeds will grow up into new plants and set seeds themselves. A completely natural response to fire. But if those fires occur too often, then they haven't matured and set seed before the second fire comes along, and then they can be eliminated. So we're really worried about those species. There's a bunch of threatened species included in that list. And then the third thing would be those animals and plants that really need a long unburnt period. So, I mean, typically, the area of long unburnt is going to be reduced. And we're worried about things like animal species that require hollows. So we're talking about things like possums and gliders and cockatoos. So they're at some degree of threat. And then, so that's animals and plants. But then the other increase in risk is really for life and property. So we can expect damaging fires to increase both in their size and their frequency. Again, as I mentioned, it's really the thing that we're particularly worried about is these extreme events, so the events at the edge. And we've had some examples recently in the USA, the Lahaina fire in Hawaii, and more previous to that, the Camp Fire in California, were really occurring in places where we didn't expect wildfires to have an impact. And what really happened in both of those cases is the fire actually came from the bush, the wildlands, and punched into the urban interface, into densely populated areas. And essentially, this is, to me and a lot of other people in this space, this is the thing that we're really worried about now. I'm actually speaking to you from Nipaluna, Hobart, which is a really good example. In 1967, they had a really severe fire and 60 people were killed. You can imagine now it's going to be 2 degrees hotter. The air is, with the warmth also becomes a drying trend because moisture in the fuels will dry out faster. So those fires, a fire like that could occur more frequently, could be worse. And in some ways, they were lucky in 67 in the wind direction, skirted the town, but the next one could come right into the town. And so those are the kinds of things that we're particularly worried about. Look, having said all those doom and gloom things, I too tend to be an optimist. So I think there are some glimmers of hope. The first thing is that most animals and plants are supremely well adapted to fire. And so, for example, we've done some work where we've been out to immediately after the 2019-20 fires, and it's amazing to see how many of the actual animals survived those fires. Another thing that people don't really, we don't really understand how this is going to play out, but if you do have more fires, it's actually going to cause a thinning out of the vegetation, say in the forests. And so eventually there will be less fuels to burn, and so those fires will become less common and less intense. So sort of bringing it back to what it is now, albeit with the changed vegetation. And then I think the last point of optimism is maybe some of the stuff that Jesse and or Heather are going to talk about, is that as time goes by, our ability to plan for, to respond to, and to recover from fires is increasing all the time. So we don't have to consider ourselves in complete peril.
No, thanks for that, Owen. And I think one of the things I remember from the Black Summer bushfires in 1920 was just the number of animals that perished in that fire, which is, tragically sad. A really quick follow-up question to that. Do you think the public and the communities around those, I guess, areas with large amounts of forest and bush realise that their risk is growing increasingly dangerously? Like, do you think there's a sense that this risk is real?
It's hard to answer that question. What they find in the social research is that people who live in the bush have a pretty good sense that they have a risk, but they don't do a great deal about it. And so I suspect that they also realize that risk is increasing, but what they can do about it is, what they tend to do can be a bit limited. It's like it's a general social issue, yeah.
Mm. And I might bring in Jesse for this next question, because I think you mentioned there around our response capabilities are going to improve at the same time. Early warnings are key to that, and having early warnings, helping people prepare and leave early when a wildfire is bearing down on them. Jesse, how can advances in technology improve our intelligence and public communications for wildfires?
Thanks, Andrew. It's quite obvious to most of us that early warning is extremely important for wildfires. At times, sometimes you have a matter of minutes to recognize that there's a threat and leave the area. It's a lot different from hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, things like that, where you know that they're coming for days and days and days. Wildfires happen any time of the day or night, and if they're wind driven, they can be upon you in a matter of minutes, as we saw with the Camp Fire a few years ago in California. So technology does play a huge part of that. There's many examples around the world. Right now in California, they're using AI-driven video cameras to actually detect smoke columns coming from the mountains to get that early detection warning. The technology that we're using in Overwatch Imaging, we have aerial mounted cameras that use AI algorithms that can automatically map and detect fires. So there's a lot of different opportunities to use technology in the space to not only to get the early recognition, but also to pre-plan for that too. So if you get some weather prediction modeling out of that, you can also do some machine learning with different AI capabilities that can identify fuel moistures, that can identify wind patterns, and using supercomputers and different things, you can come up with really beautiful fire modeling and fire behavior in a matter of minutes. So you can, put a pinpoint on a map and see where that fire is going to burn at any given day, any given hour, with a certain or specific weather event as well. So, the technology is always advancing and it's always changing. So it's crucial that all of the fire agencies around the world adopt early warning and the use of technology to get that early warning out to folks as soon as possible.
Well, I guess that's somewhat positive that there's options coming, I guess, and the technology will continue to improve and advance in that space. I'll jump to Heather for the next question, and I think it's sort of taking back a step and thinking the first step, I guess, is for people to build up their own level of resilience. And I wanted to ask Heather, how can communities build their own resilience to the impact of bushfires and wildfires?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you for that question. So when we look at this, we really look at what can you do in the community? And I saw some stuff in there in the chat about, what can an individual help to do it to protect a species or something like that. Well, what can an individual do to help their home and help their community? And so I'm at the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre in Canada. We have a program here nationally that's called FireSmart. And FireSmart looks at how you can help your home be what we call a strong passive defense. So a passive defense is not requiring to have firefighters or have people there present. It's how can you make your home defensible against ember transport and stuff like that might catch it on fire. And there's some really, really simple, inexpensive things that people can do. They can just go into their backyard, into their back garden, and it doesn't have to be expensive. It's something that you can just go and do right away. And it's something that you can involve a community, or you can even just do with your neighbors or by yourself. And a simple thing is to have no flammable material within the first meter of your home. So that is just from the ground just have cement or like no flammable material within the first meter. It's as simple as not having a wooden gate going to your house, not planting flammable bushes right up against your house. In Canada, people have wood piles. Don't pile wood up against your house. Decks, all these kind of things. What you can do for passive defense that can really help so that we don't end up in these situations where you have house-to-house ignitions and things like that. And there's national programs in Canada with Fire Smart. There's a national program in the US with, it's called FireWise. And in Australia, a lot of, there's so much interaction in Australia with the volunteer organizations and the communities that there's like programs, people will come by your house and they will actually do an assessment to see what there is. And then that's just, what we call home hardening. But there's other things that are happening at community levels in terms of planning. There's prescribed burning or hazard reduction burning. And there's also even as simple as, so I live in Kelowna and there was houses lost here this summer. And now you can no longer buy cedar hedges and juniper bushes at the local vegetation sales people. I can't remember, I've lost the word right now, but you can't buy them locally anymore because they've banned them because they're a known fire hazard. So they're not native to this ecosystem and they're actually like more flammable. So it's something that planting something a little bit different, planting what's native to your ecosystem is beneficial, and it's also beneficial to the ecology.
So, I mean, the number one thing should be people, I guess, one, not building in a bushfire or wildfire at risk area. But I know I have a house and it's right on the edge of a national park, so I'm no good at that either. But in the case that there are situations that people are living in these areas, is it possible, theoretically, to build a home that's resilient to wildfires with all our current technology?
Like, I think it's possible to build a home that is resistant, but not a home that's impermeable. So what I mean by that is there's choices that you can make in building materials. So 20 years ago, there was another Kelowna fire. That's where I am again. And some houses were lost. And at that point in time, there's actually cedar shake roofs, and the cedar shake roofs were spreading roof to roof. Now you won't see any cedar shake homes in Kelowna. You'll see asphalt shingles or metal roofs. So it's possible to harden your home against bushfires, and there is lots of evidence that choices in building materials and keeping a clean yard and planting for the ecology, etc., can really do a lot to make your home, your individual house, resilient. There's another thing. There's a split side of this though. People like to live with nature, right? So if there's ways that we can have trees and we can have plants and figure out scientifically based ways to have our community shaped, like maybe have the road on the outside of the community and then the homes, that provides a barrier. There's all kinds of research going into this area of how to quote unquote fire smart or fire wise or engage in community planning or individual homes to make our homes and communities more resilient to wildfires, more resistant, but then also how do we respond to them when they do happen, and how do we respond to community members that are impacted.
No, thanks for that, Heather. That's certainly some food for thought there. I wanted to now jump into, I guess, the next step in this sort of process of if you're building a house and once a wildfire is bearing down, and I'll bring in the rest of the panel for this question as well. Given we've got this increasing risk of bushfire, wildfire, what are your thoughts collectively on the approach of staying and defending when a wildfire is bearing down on you? What are your thoughts on that? We'll start with maybe Owen on this question.
Okay, I'm going to be the contentious one. So the evidence is pretty clear when we've done scientific studies on the factors that contribute to house loss or prevention of house loss, that defending your house is very, very effective. So in most situations, if you stay with your house with good equipment, you will save your house from a fire. On the other hand, of course, it's risky, and people have, many people in the past have died while defending their houses. So I think the issue is trying to understand when a fire transitions from being relatively manageable to being catastrophic and something that you should, under no circumstances, be anywhere near. And we don't really have a very good handle on that. So it's very difficult to actually give people general advice about whether or not you should stay and defend, which is why I think the authorities, generally speaking, do suggest that you leave. And then I know in Canada and the United States, you don't really have a choice, you have to leave.
Heather, I'll go to refer to you on this one. We'll go now to Canada. What are your thoughts on stay and defend?
So when Owen said, "Oh, he'll go the contentious way," I think it's because my thoughts have strongly been, and Owen and I have discussed this before, I would never recommend anybody to stay and defend their house. So I spent 10 years fighting fires. And one of the things is that even in terms of human reactions, I give people a good example. If you go and start up a campfire and then you go and make it really smoky, and then you go and stick your head in that smoke and think that you're going to stay there and make rational decisions for 3 hours, it is a incredibly difficult environment for people to be in. And people have to be thinking rationally and calmly, and they really need to have assessed the risk of their individual property and know what risks they're getting into. And it is quite dangerous. So people have died doing it. You know, the Fire Smart program recommends passive defense so that you can make your home harder for sparks and ember transport and stuff to impact your home, regardless of whether a person is present or not. And also in Canada, people do a lot of sprinkler protection units and stuff like that, where they maybe be able to put up sprinklers and then walk away. And it's not an individual person putting up sprinklers. It's actually a community protection, and they're all interlinked. So sometimes they get frustrated because they might actually go and turn the water off at individual homes in order to have enough water for the right timing for this community defense kind of angle. So that's the thing where I think if we harden our homes in ways, cleaning them up and stuff like that, we don't need to have people in the way, and we don't need to be risking people's lives.
For sure. Thanks for that insight. And now we'll head to the United States and Jesse, for your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I appreciate Heather and Owen being the sacrificial lambs on this, so I don't have to be the bearer of bad news. You know, here in the States, you know, obviously we, and I can speak as, you know, like Heather, I was a firefighter for 30 years, so I've been on the other side of it. And oftentimes when it's time that when people have decided they want to stay and defend their homes, and then they realize that, you know, it's getting too hot, it's getting too dangerous, and they decide to leave, oftentimes it's too late. You know, and unfortunately, that's when we see the fatalities. As Heather mentioned, you know, the best thing you can do is prepare your home before the fire starts. Harden your home, get wildfire resilient landscaping, do whatever you can do to mitigate those hazards that are around your home that might cause, you know, your home to start to catch fire. You know, so I'm a very strong advocate of when a warning goes out, then you evacuate. You know, when we go out there to fight a fire, we're going out there with the assumption that we don't need to worry about saving the lives of people that are necessarily in the area. We hope that people will make the right decisions and leave the areas before that. You know, one, it clears the roads. You know, we have civilians driving through the fire, you know, clogging up the roads. You know, great examples of campfire. You know, I bring that up again, but you see images of the campfire when that occurred. And they had 4 lanes of a highway that were completely stopped by people trying to evacuate at the last minute. They couldn't get resources in, they couldn't get resources out. So, you know, there's a lot of advantages, and it is contentious. You know, there are people that are staunchly believing in the, you know, that we are not going to leave, we are going to fight and you know, stay and defend our homes. And oftentimes it works out great, but it's those times that it doesn't. And it really, you know, it reinforces that as soon as there's an early warning, as soon as you feel danger, then you need to leave.
It's certainly a challenge, and I think that probably applies to other natural hazards as well. I know in my experience of floods, people just generally don't want to leave. They just don't see that the threat is big, and it's certainly a challenge, I think, for all of us to consider how we start to make that risk more obvious and encourage the community to take action. Jess, you've had a lot of experience in this space. As you said, with all that firefighting experience, I wanted to ask you both in your personal and professional experience. Can you give us an example of how technology has actually started to help with wildfire management?
Yeah, sure. Just right off the top of my head, we had an example this year with Overwatch Imaging where, so we run a program called NIROPS in the States, and that's a aerial-based program put on by the U.S. Forest Service. They use one of our cameras, or actually several of our cameras mounted on different aircraft, and we fly around the entire United States mapping and detecting fires for them. There was one example this summer where we mapped 28 fires in about a 4-hour period. So you're gaining real-time intelligence on these fires, on locations, if there's been a burnout, where it's jumped over the containment lines in almost real time. So back in the days, when I started, in the mid 90s, we didn't have this technology. So a lot of times it was, sticking our heads out of the helicopters with a notepad saying, I think this is where the fire line is. And try to make rational decisions and sound tactical decisions off that. It's difficult. Now, with technology advancements, you can map a fire line within minutes, send that information down using a cell network or some type of downlink system, and have real-time, absolute information of where the fire is, where it's going to be in the next 30 minutes, next 25 minutes, next 5 minutes. So all these different technologies that are coming out right now are absolutely crucial in the aspect of wildland firefighting and bush firefighting.
And what about, we spoke about everyone needing to evacuate before a bushfire. Are there examples you can sort of share with us today around maybe how technology supported some of these evacuations, or at least encourage people who are at risk to leave early?
Sure. I'll use the example of in California, they got a thing called California Alert, or Wildfire California Alert, or something like that. If you look on the map, and there's a website for it, there's literally probably 400 or 500 different cameras now in California. They're pan tilt zoom cameras. You can look at those anytime. It's all public facing, and those are all tied into dispatch centers around the state and frankly around the western U.S. They're all up and down the coast and throughout the Rockies and Southeast as well. These will help give early warning to the agencies, to the civilians in the areas that, hey, there is something going on. Maybe I should, pay a little bit of attention to it, so that when that warning does come out, that they're fully prepared to go.
No, that's great, and good to know. Wanted to ask one more question before we start to go to the questions online, because we've got quite a few questions online to consider as well. I wanted to ask you, as an everyday person, how can communities do something to prepare themselves to reduce their own risk to wildfires and bushfires?
Well, I think Heather's covered a fair bit of this, and I think maybe one thing to remember is that the research is starting to highlight that the majority of houses that burn down are actually because of embers, and so it's not the sheer power of the fire; it's the fact that embers have landed somewhere on your house, in your garden, and that has caused the fire. So thinking about that, I'll come back to that in a moment. I think that the first thing you should do is that all of the state government agencies, the Rural Fire Service here in New South Wales, or CAL FIRE in California, they have advice on these things. And as Heather was saying, it really revolves around the fuels in your garden. And you can think of it in these zones or onion rings. The closest one is the most important. Get rid of all fuels that are likely to cause a flame to go from that to your house. And then think about the next zone out, and reduce the cover. It doesn't mean to say you can't have shrubs and trees, but you have to have reduced cover. They have to be separated by gaps. And then that's a zone up to about 10 meters away. And then there's a 30-meter zone where you can have a little bit more. There's advice about all this sort of stuff available to you. Heather mentioned joining up to official groups. What do you call it? Fire smart in where you live. There are also things like in a lot of places, I know that fire agencies can provide a thing called a community fire unit, which is actually a set of hose pipes in a trailer. They can help you defend a whole street. And what that tends to do is it comes with training so that you start to understand a lot more about your fire risk. You're not necessarily even going to use that thing when the fire comes, because as everyone else was saying, it might be safer to leave, but you actually have a better understanding. And it also brings all the people in the community together so that they can share responsibility. Because when I think back to the situation I was mentioning in Lahaina fire and some of these other really big fires and the ones we're really worried about, this is about fire spreading from one house to another. And what that means is, in some ways, the biggest risk you've got is not what you're doing in your garden, but what your neighbors are doing. And so it's a collective responsibility. And I think, it's very, very hard to do this stuff, but that's where the solution comes, is everyone coming together and doing it together.
Sure, and I just back in there and definitely give it a plug to joining a local volunteer agency where you can, if it's joining a community fire unit or the Rural Fire Service or an agency community emergency response team, however it is in your country, certainly worth doing, and certainly how I got into this space myself. One more question. I said only one more, but I've got another question I'm just really keen to understand from the panel around government. So all these agencies, all the sort of the fire agencies, are generally part of the government, and really want to understand, as we're seeing this increased risk, are we seeing any government policy changes that you feel, and asking the panel collectively here, that you might think have a positive impact on how it can decrease the severity of natural weather events in terms of decrease the impact of these? Is there any government policy in this space changing, and do you think it will over the coming years as we see this risk become more prominent? Maybe I'll start with Heather on this one. I want you to go for it.
Yeah, with this one, very quick one. I think those people who live in Australia will remember only this week we had the terrible outage of the Optus network, telephone network. And one of the things that happens in a bushfire is you can lose your telephone coverage. And one of the responses to make this better is to allow interoperability between all the different networks. So, and that's just one minor aspect of the fact that government policies are moving in the right direction to ensure that there's intelligence is available to people.
No, fantastic. Heather, any thoughts on government policy?
Yeah, so this is really an interesting area, because wildfire goes from people's houses and people's yards to landscape, right? And it influences everything along the way. So we really saw this year, where Canadian wildfires were putting smoke into New York and affecting New York's sporting events and like flights, all kinds of things, businesses, health, etc. So Canadian wildfires were affecting a whole other country. So in terms of government and policy, I think that government and policy is definitely on the right path. You can look down into Victoria. I know even the planning, they're changing how they're planning neighborhoods, new subdivisions, new neighborhoods. Planning is being changed. Governments are reaching out and they're looking for help on evidence-based decision-making. So they don't want to just do things ad hoc. They want to have reasons for doing things, and reasons that are informed by ecology, reasons that are informed by community, reasons that are informed by technology, and reasons that are informed, frankly, by the people who are voting for them. So all of those things are important, and you sit there and you go, yes, they are making moves forward, but we want to keep things in scope with what can we do individually and what can we do, as citizens. So a big thing about that is how can you influence as citizens, and it is, like, what can you do to fix your own backyard, both like figuratively and literally, like, what can you go and do in your own backyard, but also how can you be involved in your local government to help harden your community?
Thanks, Heather. And finally to Jesse, your organisation works across international borders. You've worked with many governments. Have you seen much in the government policy space changing as a result of this increased threat of natural hazards?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, like Heather mentioned, I think the thing that's most visible is coming out with new policy, right? So where you can and can't build homes, where you can and can't build subdivisions, and if you do build in certain areas, you know, there's got to be certain levels of different restrictions to make your homes resilient, defendable at least. But the thing I've seen pretty much with all of everywhere that we work currently, you know, we're on 6 different continents with our technology. The problem is funding. You know, a lot of governments aren't funded and not funding the agencies well enough. And you know, nobody likes to be taxed. You know, nobody likes to have to pay another, you know, just another bill. But the criticality of funding these fire agencies and these first responders is absolutely important. If there's no funding, there's no resources, there's no equipment, there's no apparatus, there's no appliances, there's no technology. So you know, if we can influence anything with any of the governments that we work with, it's you must fund your fire agencies.
No, good insight there, and it's certainly becoming more and more expensive for governments to work in this space. We've got a lot of questions. I want to jump on the Q&A before we get too carried away, because I know we've got limited time left. And there's a question there for you, Owen, and it's about are there things that people can do in their own lives around planting particular species or certain types of trees that allow for birds to habitat in them, and gardening in certain animal-friendly ways that allow for burrowing? Is there some way that maybe even Landcare could help with this? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hadn't heard that one about burrowing before. It's interesting, but I think the general answer is, if you've got a native garden, you know, plant a native garden that's got all the flowers and different layers of vegetation like shrubs and trees. That's always positive. If you are in a fire affected area and you're interested in those hollow nesting animals, you can actually put up a nest box. So there are these things, designs for these things are available online from various different groups that can tell you how to do it. And one other thing, I don't know if you knew about this, but after the 2019 fires, there were lots of volunteers going out into the forests, distributing food around the forests, like for the animals. No one knows how much of support that was, but feeding stations were put up, and you can get involved in that.
Yeah, it's definitely been. I know a lot of my work in New South Wales government's been looking at those wildlife volunteers. We've had plenty of people out there doing that. It's hard to measure, I think, the impact they did, but it was, I think, pretty huge. Heather, a question for you, and this is around housing developments. And we're seeing it, I know in Australia, there's housing developments placing houses very close together with the eaves almost touching. The question asks, how is it possible to limit the risk of fire spreading from house to house? This is a particular problem in areas of the Illawarra with those housing estates sitting on the edge of forests.
So there are materials that are quote unquote more fire smart in terms of you know, more robust building materials that help to reduce that spread between house to house. So you know, there's things in terms of having, you know, like having multi-pane windows and not having flammable siding and all of those kind of things that can help, and same with not having flammable roofs. And if the houses are actually close in density and they're not that flammable material, there's actually a low likelihood that they're going to start into that house-to-house ignition. Like initially, you need to have something light the first house. So, you know, and then the first house becomes flammable enough and it starts to light the next house. But if we can avoid lighting the first house, then that's the big, you know, like the big solution, right? And one of the things about having more dense houses is when you get into like that increased level of density, if you didn't do the house to house ignition, or if you didn't get the houses started in the wildland urban interface, then they're actually pretty robust. Like you get into neighborhoods where you're crossing over streets and you don't have a lot of vegetation and you're losing some of the ember transport and stuff like that. And those houses are actually more resilient to fire than other areas. Jesse might be able to speak a little bit more to this, because I think California faces more of those bigger, large house-to-house fires than we do here in Canada. Canada's, relatively lucky in terms of geography and population. But yeah, it's like when you get into that high density, there's a lot of barriers that are coming into play as well. It's that wildland urban interface is what we call it, the WUI, or like, the areas on the outskirts where they're close to the bush. Those really are the critical areas in order to stop those initial ignitions.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Heather. And
yeah.
I'll pass to Jesse.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, with what Heather said. The urban interface, you have to do whatever you can to stop that fire before it enters that interface. As we've seen time and time again in California, across the Western U.S., that first house that goes, and especially if it's a wind-driven fire, it could destroy an entire neighborhood, as we saw in Camp Fire. So it goes back to a lot of things, right? So pretty much everything we've talked about tonight, whether it's making your home resilient to wildfire, mitigating the hazards around your home so the fire doesn't start, and if it does, prevent that transmission from house to house. It's very difficult, especially when you get into these more dense areas. If one house fire does start, it's very difficult to then catch that fire again. A lot of times you just have to wait for it to burn out. Unfortunately, property and things like that are easier to rebuild than a life is, obviously. So, that's another reason why we always say to evacuate when you can. So there are a whole list of things that you can do to prevent, mitigate, and prepare yourself for that time when wildfire does happen. So, hopefully folks are picking something out of this and learning something out of this so that we can, have one less fire.
Andrew, if
Thanks,
I could
Jesse.
add a little thing,
Sure.
a little snippet into this conversation. Now, I'm doing some research on how fires are spreading through the communities at the moment, and I've been diving into the research on urban conflagrations, and a lot of this stuff has been done in Japan. And it seems like when a house is on fire, all the heat comes out of it through the window. So where you've got two houses next to each other, I would say if you want to concentrate on one thing, is do not have windows anywhere near each other facing that gap.
No, excellent. And I think there's lots to learn from different countries in this space of experiences before. One of the things I just wanted to point in the chat there was that message from Amanda Finley around the Fortis House in the Shoalhaven. It's a really interesting project that is worth checking out. I know we did a podcast recently with Greg Webb, who lives at Lake Conjola, rebuilding his house with a Fortis home and using some really sort of bushfire resistant materials in that. So worth checking out if you're interested in that. And yeah, Greg's a great guy as well. I wanted to also refer to a question from the audience here to the panel, and it's going to be around prescribed burning. Can the panel discuss the benefit of prescribed burning happening closer to the urban interface rather than broad-scale forest burns? Maybe Jesse, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, as absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. There's a lot of communities that are doing just that, where they're creating a fire barrier between them and the wildlands, the bushlands. You can go in there and you can tactically decide, based on a lot of education experience, where those fires will burn if they do burn up to the communities. And you can mitigate that by having prescribed burns. We see this all throughout the states. Forest Service out there burning, and it doesn't have to be hundreds and hundreds of hectares of land. It could be a section of 300 meters or whatever it's going to take to create that natural barrier as that fire approaches. It hits that natural barrier that you've created from that prescribed burn, and the fire goes out. It goes out, and problem solved. So I'm a big advocate of it. I think it's absolutely crucial, especially when you're reaching into the urban interface environments.
Thanks, Jesse. And I'll just ask Heather or Owen any quick thoughts on that you might have before we jump in the next question, given limited time left.
Oh, yeah, just one quick thing. We think it's pretty clear that doing these prescribed burns close to where the houses are can be pretty effective, but the fuels, especially in Australia, they recover very quickly. So doesn't give you protection for very long. And also, this is a space where Indigenous cultural burning could have quite a lot of value. That's not just for risk reduction, but it's for healthy country, but it could be a double benefit.
Fantastic. Heather, I'm going to double stack another question as well, because I think this is probably relevant for you. It's a question from Sean. How do we prepare community and build resilience in getting them to understand their risk, planning controls, fire mitigation maintenance, and pre-planning actions around stay and defend, and when to leave early? A lot in that question, but I might pass to you to answer that one, Heather.
Put it to me to answer that. Well, you know, I will come back and just say that I will always say, don't stay and defend, leave. That I'll just say that because I just think that lives are worth more than houses. So houses we can rebuild. And I think it's incredibly tragic when people lose their life and their house burnt down. You know, it's not a space that I think that we should be in, hopefully, if we can harden homes against that. But within that, like talking about prescribed burning and talking about cultural burning and talking about landscape planning and all of these kind of things, there's things that we can be doing where we don't have to push ourselves to those extremes. We don't have to put ourselves in those situations. And what I mean by that is, like, in British Columbia, Canada, there's First Nations are really involved in cultural burning, and there's more and more partnerships between cultural burning and prescribed burning and the fire management agencies and landscape planning and community forests. And there's this community called Logan Lake, which is like one of these, you know, like wonderful little communities that you actually bring people out to and you say, see here, this huge fire approached this community, and they were completely engaged in fire smart activities, and they had a community forest and all of the other things, and they like rode this through, and they didn't have any houses lost, and they weren't having people stay and defend. They weren't putting people into risk. So you can think about these things in terms of prescribed burning, but you can also think about, you know, do you want to put a green space or a park like outside of a suburb or something like that? Like, where do you want to put community green spaces, and what do you want those community green spaces to be so that they're making your community resilient to wildland urban interface fires? There's things that we can do that we can think of on policy levels. Governments are doing them, and lots of them are research supported, and it's about integrating that research that's already been done. Like Owen here talks about some of the you know, prescribed fire in terms of targeted prescribed fire. Owen's actually done research on this. I know that he's researched and he's published in this area. So you have a whole bunch of research that's already out there, and it's about integrating it. And you also have more research that needs to be done to be supporting those decisions so that we can take those, you know, citizen taxpayer dollars and invest them effectively.
Yeah, some big issues to consider there. And I want to ask another question of you, similar to that, but it's all sort of the crux of all these issues, because we've talked about early warnings, we've talked about building resistant homes and government policy. But one of the questions in the chat is talking about some of the challenges we're facing, how big the fires are going to be. And what we need to be doing, and that fires are occurring in areas where they previously didn't. So the community isn't really expecting a fire everywhere. So the question is, what can be done, or what research is needed to encourage communities to engage with fire resilience?
Who was that to?
Oh, so that was to you, Owen, sorry.
Oh, to me. Oh, blimey.
I'll leave you with a hard one.
Look, there are people doing research in this area, and all the government agencies have staff that are involved in this area. And it's hard because I think in the end of the day, the most effective thing you can do is have personal relationships with each individual household. And it takes an awful lot of time. You've got to knock on people's doors and visit their gardens and give them an appraisal of their garden and that sort of stuff. I mean, Heather mentioned that some of the agencies will actually do that for you if you ask. They'll come and do it for you. And there are community groups also that sometimes will do that for you. But I mean, it's a tall task to do that for everybody. But that's sort of the scale of the thing that we need to do.
Yeah, I think none of these things are easy, are they? And one final question. I know we're running out of time here, so I'll just I'll pop this to the panel. How much are we able to do to understand or reintroduce cultural burning practices in areas where vegetation mixes have changed due to land use change and the challenge of connection to country? I'm not sure who might be best for this one, but it's around cultural burning. Anyone want to jump in with an answer for that one?
I'll have a go. I've been
Sounds
involved in
good.
this sort of stuff a little bit. Aboriginal people usually, when they're talking about doing cultural burning, they're usually talking about bringing country back to health because they see it as sick to start with. So they don't, so it has changed and they want to bring it back. And then from the scientist point of view, there's a lot we don't understand about how this all plays out. But I think the approach we take is to say, right, we're on board with what you're doing. We will treat this as what we call an adaptive management program. So we will do the science behind monitoring what it's actually doing ecologically. And then we will understand what's happening and whether what we're doing is going in the direction we want it to. And then if it's not, then think about how you could change it. So adaptive management, I think, is the approach.
For sure. Well, that's probably all we have time for in terms of questions today. And thank you to everyone, and thank you to the panel for joining us. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to pass to Owen, or back to Owen, just give a few words on how people joining us today can help by contributing to the Bushfire Research and Recovery Fund. So Owen, can I just pass you for a few words on that before you close for today?
Thanks, Andrew. So yes, so thanks for coming, everybody. And if you do feel motivated to give some a donation of money, there's a couple of areas that projects that we are involved with, but we sort of need more money to move them forward. One of them is, I mentioned already that I'm doing this research on how fires spread through interface communities. And it's really looking from an individual house basis, historical patterns of fire spread in fires that actually have happened. And one of the things we want to do is bring our American colleague, Alexandra Seifert, who's probably the foremost house loss fire researcher in the world. We want to bring her over here to do some collaborative work. The way our funding works, we can't pay her to do that, but from a donation fund, we could do that. And the second thing is we've got some collaborators who are doing fire sticks cultural burning on the south coast of New South Wales, and it would be really useful to use some money to actually help to pay them do the burns. And they're always strapped for cash, and if we could do that, then we can support them with that adaptive management, science monitoring stuff, and get more of this stuff happening.
Excellent. Thank you, Owen. And those links are in the chat there for our North American colleagues and for everyone else if they're interested in donating to the Bushfire Research and Recovery Fund. That's unfortunately what we have time for today. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join us for the webinar. I know I certainly found this a really valuable and interesting discussion, and I'm sure you did as well. A big thank you to our panelists, Owen, Heather, and Jesse. And thank you to the University of Wollongong for hosting this event, and look forward to the next one. Until next time, stay safe and good night or good day for wherever you are in the world. Thanks again. See you next time.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.